tenemos este segundo coloquio, que será una sesión en inglés titulada ESG, What do the perspective of supervisors and financial services users have in common? La mesa está formada por Joe McGrath, University College Dublín, doña Carmen de Vivero, Universidad de Málaga, don José López, Edufinet, y está moderada por don Eugenio Olmedo, doctor europeo en Derecho por la Universidad de Bolonia y profesor titular de la Universidad de Málaga. Cuando quiera.
Okay. Thank you so much to each one of you. We are going to begin with this really interesting table about the environmental, social and governance criteria in capital markets. And I would like to ask some questions to each one of you. So let's just begin with Joe McGrath. There have been different moves to enhance ESG over a long period of time, but ESG has not been universally embraced. How has ESG changed? In what ways do our contemporary understanding of ESG depend on historical practices? Can you give us some examples of how has been this evolution of ESG over history, in your opinion?
Sure, thank you, Eugenio. Technology, folks, is great. Thank you for the question, and thank you to the organisers for organising such a wonderful conference of this kind. It's my first time in Málaga. It's a really beautiful city. I'm enjoying it. I've met wonderful people here. But to answer the question, ESG has a very long history. It goes back as a research area about a century. So going back to the 1930s, 1940s, we would have called ESG by a different name. We would have called it corporate social responsibility back then. And writing as early as the 1930s, Bowen, who is considered the father of corporate social responsibility, he asked a very simple question. What responsibilities, what duties should businessmen, and it was businessmen back then, what responsibilities should businessmen reasonably be accepted to assume? And that question has animated us since about the 1930s, 1940s. Over a period of decades, this developed as a research area, and Davis, a prolific researcher in this area, he introduced what he called the iron law of responsibility. And the iron law of responsibility suggests that as people have more power, as businesses have more power, they ought to have more responsibilities too, more obligations. In the 1970s, the idea of corporate citizenship emerges, particularly in the US. And this is the idea that businesses should assume responsibilities just as any citizen would. And the idea of neighbourliness emerges as a research area. And there are two phases to CSR, corporate social responsibility, neighbourliness. First, there's the idea that businesses, corporations, shouldn't do any harm to the neighbourhood in which they're based. And then secondly, there's the idea that businesses should work to promote the good of the neighbourhood, to improve the neighbourhood. The idea develops that corporations should invest quite widely, engage quite widely, engage in politics, promote the welfare of their employees, promote the welfare of the community. But the idea that corporations should engage in politics is a really controversial one. To what extent do we really want companies, businesses, to promote a particular political agenda? Do we really only want companies to be involved in politics when there are politics, when we agree with the agenda that a particular corporation is proposing? In the 1980s, a broader research agenda develops. It's less about how we define corporate social responsibility, and more thinking emerges about how CSR is a process and not just an outcome. It's about thinking that it's not about just donating money to charity. It's about embedding CSR and mainstreaming it within an organisation. It's about thinking, where do we source goods from? How do we treat the employees in a particular business? In the 1990s then, coming more into modern day, the idea of corporate citizenship becomes even more pronounced, particularly in the US. And that leads to all sorts of interesting cases, including the relatively recent Citizens United case involving corporate spending in politics. The idea develops really that as we are imposing more duties on companies, maybe they should also have more rights. And this is something we might consider as in the EU, we are increasingly imposing duties on companies and on company directors, including a duty on company directors to consider the impact of their decisions in terms of sustainability. To what extent might that lead to outcomes that we might not fully anticipate now? To what extent might that be the basis for companies and company directors to acquire more rights also? Interestingly, this idea of ESG has really only emerged in the last 2 decades as a concept or a particular term that's used, I think. And we're seeing an increased move for more transparency, more disclosure, the imposition of directors' duties and so on in this area. Interestingly enough, again, in the US, there's now a backlash against ESG. There's a movement against it. It's seen, particularly by conservative Republican politicians, it's seen as being something associated with woke politics or woke capitalism. It will be interesting to see, notwithstanding the fact that I think there is a strong commitment to ESG in Europe, it would be interesting to see if that kind of movement also develops here in time. Thank you.
It's a quite interesting point of view, also that of you, considering that the ESG is quite a process. It's an historical concept, and so it's evolving as history evolves. So I think it's quite an interesting point to take into account. My next question goes to Professor De Vivero, and I would like to ask you your opinion about what is the role of ESG criteria in the corporate value chain.
Thank you, Professor Olmedo. Firstly, I would like to thank you, the organization, and my former colleague, José María López, to be here in this round table with my friends, my mentor in Dublin, and my colleagues and my friends. So, answer the question, acting in a responsible and sustainable manner with the environment, society and stakeholders, such as employees and shareholders, for example, has gone from being an option for companies to becoming an increasing demand from consumers. So, what is the importance of the ESG criteria in many production processes? Because that is the question. No. The time when we were guided to purchase or not to purchase a product or a service, taking into account only its price, usefulness, or duration, is a question that's long gone. So ESG criteria represent a way of doing business, not only taking into account its profitability or business success, but only put the focus on the strategy and the well-being, the environment in which the different companies develop their activities. So the acronym ESG criteria, ESG standards for environmental, social and governance, encompasses the criteria used to evaluate the organization impact in these 3 areas. So more companies are making their operations sustainable through environmental, social and governance standards. Why? To comply the law, leverage new business models and adapt to ongoing changes in consumers' demands. So, having said that, ESG criteria involve all parties in a company's activity and therefore in its value chain. So, in this chain, each party represents a link that involved in the process adds value, for example, improving its characteristics, adding new ones to product or service until it's ready to purchase to the consumer. So I give you a clear example about that. If you are looking for a birthday gift for a friend and have found 2 choices of a sneaker, for example, you will want to guess as much information as possible about each one to make a better decision, no? Wouldn't you? So if, in addition, you know that your friend is very interested in issues related to sustainability and care to the environment, the first thing that you will take into account is, for example, the material that has been used for its elaboration. Or, for example, you would consider if the company has chosen recycled raw material to make the soles. So that is the question that you ask in that moment. So all this involves making a comparative judgment of the information you find on the different products and services and the brands. So what are the benefits of applying ESG standard with the value chain? In this way, regardless of the sector, companies usually monitor their customer to find out what they think about them, and also about the suppliers, strategic partners, shareholders, investors, and other participants in the value chain. So this is why it's key for companies to act under sustainable criteria, because if a company doesn't know how one of its suppliers works, it's taking the risk that any negative event of that suppliers could harm it and its direct impact in the relationship with this supplier in this case. So, in addition, ensuring that ESG criteria are represented throughout around the value chain and the other benefits. For example, I write here, such as the better management of all the natural resources used, having more motivated, committed, and productive workers. So all of that influence in the value chain, more or less in the value chain. We have some examples about companies in Spain. So one of the companies, for example, has published, I don't get the name here, has published their code of ethics and conduct for suppliers and plan to promote the sustainable development and goals. So all that is, it works, so I recommend a lot that type of philosophy to follow this way, no? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vivero. My next question goes for José María López, and I would like to consider ESG in the current times. So in the times that we are suffering or we are passing nowadays with inflation, energy and political turmoil, do you think, or what's your opinion about if should central banks get involved in sustainable development and transition, or should they remain neutral and do nothing about that? What's your opinion?
Well, nice question. Well, first of all, thank you, John, for coming. And Carmen, I am your former colleague, but I'm still, your colleague at university, so I'm your current colleague. So, what I think or not, it doesn't matter. The question is, central banks are positioning in favor of the sustainability transition. If we have a look at the European Central Bank, the Bank of Spain, the Bank of Ireland, the Bank of Japan, India, the Federal Reserve, of course, all the central banks are paying attention to monetary issues, the primary mandate, financial issues, especially banking supervision, on the basis of a new risk that is climate risk. So, for sure, they are doing this. We have the example, I mentioned this morning, it's been mentioned already as well, of the energy transition. First of all, we should wonder who is paying for that. Perhaps it is not a lunch for free. At the same time, we see how this energy transition has effects, as you mentioned, on inflation, physical and transition risks, not only on banks, but also on non-financial undertakings. So, yes, we see there is something. Central banks are and should get involved. Anyway, I think, and this is my opinion, it is not just a matter of supporting the 2030 agenda, the sustainability development goals. I think we must take this, or central banks should take this to the core of their activity, especially regulating and once they supervise banks. And Joe's mentioned before, should companies get involved in politics? Here I think we should wonder the same. Should central banks get involved in politics? The answer is no. So I think they must be delicate in the way they integrate the risk, climate risk, environmental risk management in their business as usual or their traditional, ordinary activity. And, well, some interesting ideas have been mentioned already. Woke capitalism, how this at the same time can put pressure on the side of central banks for a stronger support to the sustainability transition. And very interesting what Joe said before as well. Should central banks impose duties on banks and their directors? The answer is they are doing this. But should they? Well, perhaps we could go back to this later.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask right now to Professor McGrath about his opinion on the conflict that may exist between the different stakeholders involved in ESG. When do the perspective of supervisors and other stakeholders like investors converge, and when do they, instead of that, diverge? So when do they agree and when do they disagree? Are there circumstances when activist investors want social outcomes but companies pursue financial outcomes? Is there really a conflict here or not? What's your position about that?
Thank you. I think the perspectives of supervisors and investors converge in all sorts of ways. In the first instance, supervisors are interested in the safety and soundness of the financial system, and investors are interested in the safety and soundness of their investments. So there can be a convergence there. Investors and supervisors are also interested in the long-term stability of the financial system, and where companies, where banks are able to consider the risks posed by climate change and all sorts of other matters, then they can work to mitigate those risks such that there is a long-term stable return on investment. Investors and supervisors also have a convergence of interests in terms of transparency and disclosure. Where there is increased transparency in terms of how ESG is being delivered, investors are able to make more informed decisions about what they do with their money. And supervisors in return are able to use that information to assess compliance. Now, there are areas of convergence, as I mentioned, but there are also significant divergences between what supervisors want and investors may want. Supervisors are really interested in the integrity of the financial system, but investors may possibly be more interested in financial returns. But that's not universally true. Some investors are more interested in social outcomes as well as financial outcomes. And even as I pitch that, those two things are not incompatible. And whenever I think of investors who are interested in this idea of a social return as well as a financial one, I think of the nuns who nudge, the so-called nuns who nudge. This is an order of a religious order in Pennsylvania. It's the Order of St. Francis. And the Order of St. Francis, about 500 nuns in this convent, and they took all their pension contributions and they decided that they would invest them in companies to try to promote ESG. And they said they were doing God's work in doing this. And this is a very, very clever, interesting strategy that these nuns have produced. They're using a combination of corporate law and soft power to try to achieve ESG objectives. So they buy the minimum number of shares in a company, usually about $2,000 worth. It's just enough to be able to put forward a resolution at the AGM of the company. And then they ring up the CEO of the company. It might be Goldman Sachs, it might be whoever. And they say, we're going to put this resolution forward at the AGM. Why don't you meet us beforehand to discuss it? And so you have an agenda being put forward by these nuns, say to try to promote more green energy initiatives, and they put this forward to oil companies and so on. These companies are very reluctant to squash nuns in public at the AGM, so they meet them. They fly in by helicopter to the grounds of the nunnery, the convent. And sometimes, not always, sometimes the nuns are successful in moving the needle just a little bit. And they have had some success in promoting all sorts of positive pro-social outcomes. And this is the idea that you can promote social justice outcomes, positive ESG outcomes, as well as try to seek financial profit. So in terms of when this tension is resolvable, it's resolvable when ESG is compatible with profit. And sometimes it means knowing which battles to pick. These nuns, for example, are very careful never to try to push the button too hard on executive compensation or any of those kinds of issues in order to secure their agenda. So that's how I think certain tensions are resolvable too.
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
You said something about soft power.
Yeah.
Is it so soft? Is my question, because we have the case, and I speak with my view of a professional of the banking sector. In the case of Europe, the European Central Bank guide on climate risk management is supposed to be soft law, but in practice, if you don't pay full attention to the 13 recommendations, you may be in some troubles. So, at the same time, this is something new for us in Spain. You come from a different legal culture, but for us, the base of our duties as corporations and individuals is law. So it's something very shocking for us now, due to that pressure developed by investors, how we have to pay attention to Spanish law, Spanish soft law, European law, international soft recommendations, yes. And it's really something very hard getting the proper answer to all these sources of finally obligations and duties for the companies and banks especially.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Good. Thanks so much. I would like to introduce in the conversation another element that is crucial today, and it's digitalization. So my next question goes for Professor De Vivero. And what is the impact of digitalization of companies in relation to sustainability? Do you think there is a connection, a relevant connection in the context of ESG or not?
the answer is, of course. Yes, in my opinion, digitalization and sustainability will continue to be the two trends that will set the corporate and regulatory agenda in the coming years. So it would be a mistake to address both processes separately and in isolation without taking into account the cross-cutting nature that both investments have in many organizations. Moreover, if we take into account the new regulatory reporting requirements, digitalization is essential to enable a more efficient and effective classification of information. And José María knows a lot about that. As an example, the new Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will force certain companies to report their current non-financial information with new standards to allow a higher degree of comparative harmonization between companies. So the nature of non-financial data is also very cross-cutting, impacting different departments in the company. So, and it has to come together in one place to transmit it to the markets. I mean, technology is essential to be able to communicate sustainability performance to the different stakeholders with greater transparency in a much short time to market. So, for instance, there are already startups that nowadays is working a circular economy project where all carbon footprint is registered in a blockchain in a visible and transparent way for all the participants in the process. So another tool that we help in this way is the taxonomy that will define what is green, what is not green. So I consider that the most effective way to take action and start making projects with the available technologies is to set concrete targets linked to sustainability. So that is, for example, there were sectors in which only cost reduction and, for example, economic benefits were measured, whereas now the carbon footprint is very much taken into account. So here I connect with the preference that many companies are currently giving to artificial intelligence over other digital investment. According to the Accenture data, around 75% of companies do so, essentially thinking about strengthening their ability to adapt to changing needs. That this is the question. So the scope of action range for the use of models to improve intelligence in the decision-making to development of advanced generative artificial intelligence technology for the creation of original content in different business decisions. So what is essential here is the responsibility for the use, development and deployment of this technology, both within organization and towards the customer. So that is the idea.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to ask you, José María, as a corporate lawyer, but also as a civil law professor, what is the position and the situation of consumers in this debate? So different financial institutions are developing a wide portfolio of sustainable financial products. But my question is, do the users really know the characteristics and the implication of this type of products? And along with that, do you think if the European regulations on the protection of consumers has any impact on this situation, on the protection of consumers considering these sustainable financial products? What is the role that the regulation for the protection of consumers should have on this matter?
Complex issue as well. If I think financial users, as consumers or consumers in general, understand what a sustainable financial product is, I wouldn't say yes by now. I mean, we may know what a green loan is. Even among professionals, among professors, it is very technical. We pay attention to the purpose of the loan, what it is applied for. But yes, do financial users really know the features of a financial product in the side of sustainability? First of all, I think something we could do is comparing different financial products among different banks. Are they the same? Are they different? If the answer is that they are very different, it means that the industry is not doing something well. We must consider as well the intense regulatory content of these contracts. We have mentioned some of the new regulations, especially coming from the European Union. And it is not an easy task, first of all, reflecting in the contracts all the clauses that should be included in them, and after that, the understanding by consumers. From the side of consumers regulation, we have the case as well, and we can think in our own experience of all the information we receive when we want to sign a financial contract. I don't know, 100 pages, 50, it depends on the contract, but it is not easy just reading and, of course, understanding. If we pay attention to the motto of the Congress, we try to link sustainability to financial education. I think that financial education should represent a first step for this link, understanding what a financial contract linked to sustainability is and their understanding by consumers. But I think that if we wanted to be useful, if we wanted to work, we have to make it easy. And by now, I see a huge complexity in financial contracts in general, and especially when they are related to sustainability. And we could add to financial education as well something that it is not new, labels. A contract could be labeled, showing the risk, liquidity, the profit, but as well showing the environmental and the social impact. If you want it to work, put it easy. I would finish.
Do you think there is some kind of dynamic competition between the different financial products and if consumers are sensitive to the changes, or there is some kind of natural evolution towards more sustainable financial products or not?
Oh, sure, yes, especially among young people.
And consumers, in your opinion, are really involved in this process? Or not, or they don't care, they just consider the economic conditions and they don't care about the environmental, social context of that?
Of course, there is an evolution. I include myself among the old citizens. I feel myself old because I see young people, have children, teenagers, and I really appreciate they have a different view on these issues. When they are not 15 but 25 and they get in touch with a branch of a bank, they will make questions I would have never done. And it will come, but we need a quick reaction, and I don't see it in the short term.
I think that financial education plays a critical role on this process, and that's one of the scopes of this conference by itself. My next question goes to Professor McGrath. When do you think that ESG works best? Is it greenwashing, and where is it authentic, and how can we tell the difference when we are just doing greenwashing, just trying to look ourselves doing this process, and when we are actually working on that?
Yeah, thank you. I had to think about this for quite a while to think of, what exactly I thought good ESG was and when it worked best. And I came up with an official list, but I'm going to give you my unofficial take on it in a moment. Officially, or in terms of a checklist, I would say if there's good, strong leadership on a particular issue, the tone at the top is right, if the objectives are clear, if you really know what you want to achieve from a particular ESG initiative, where it's integrated into business strategy. So that was the idea I was talking about earlier, that it's not just an outcome, it's a process, it's about embedding and mainstreaming a particular strategy. And where there's broad stakeholder engagement and support for a particular ESG strategy, where there's effective employee training, I'll come back to that one in a moment, where there's recognition that this particular ESG strategy is essential for long-term value creation. Now, when I really think of when ESG works well, I think of a very old article written decades ago in the Harvard Business Review by two academics called Porter and Kramer. And Porter and Kramer said, and they were talking about CSR as it was called at that time, it's the same thing now. They said that ESG or CSR works best when companies don't have to hide from what they're doing and when they don't have to promote it. And what they were really saying is the litmus test for ESG, for good ESG, is when it results in long-term benefit or profit, even if they never told anyone they were doing it. And the best personal example I can give of this is when I was in school about 25 years ago. Apple computers were very rarely used. They had a tiny share of the market. They had a really strange operating system. They were quite difficult to use. But Apple used to give heavily subsidized prices on computers to schools. So the computer lab in my school had all Apple computers in it, and I was trained on Apple computers from an early age. Every computer that I've bought since then has been an Apple computer. And Apple now has a significant share of the market in PCs and in phones and other things. In part, it's because of hundreds of strategies like that they promoted. Now, that's, I suppose, an easy win, you might say. What about more controversial areas where companies intervene? There are a couple of good examples of this where companies in the US have tried to start a conversation about race following the Black Lives Matters movement. And there have been some good examples of that and some not so good examples. Starbucks, for example, after the initiation of the BLM movement, decided that they wanted to engage positively and start a conversation on race in the US. And they asked all their baristas to write slogans on their coffee cups for their customers. So they would write things like "Race Matters" as they were giving people their coffee. This did not go down well. It didn't go down well because the leadership in Starbucks is predominantly white, and most of the baristas are either black or from a different ethnic minority. It didn't go down well because they didn't train their baristas in having what is a very complex conversation about race. It didn't go down well with their customers, who are now being engaged in really difficult conversations before they'd even had their morning coffee. Now, Nike engaged in a similar kind of campaign in a way. You may remember a few years ago, there was a really famous NFL player, football player, called Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick made the news all around the world when he started taking the knee for the national anthem. And he was doing that to start a conversation about race. Colin Kaepernick basically ended his career at that moment in football by doing that. He was attacked by the conservative right in the US for being unpatriotic, for taking a knee during the national anthem. Nike rode in behind him. Nike sponsored him. They offered him a clothing line. They offered him a footwear line. They ran ads in the Super Bowl to support him. Now, this was very, very difficult for Nike to do. Nike lost a lot of customers. People took their shoes, their Nike shoes, and they burned them on camera on social media. It made the news. But that was seen as being authentic. Nike were rowing in behind the black athletes who wore their products. It was also, I suppose, a play to their audience, their customer base, which skews left naturally. It was still difficult for Nike, but because it was authentic, it was successful for them. They didn't really take a big hit, and in fact, it boosted their integrity in many ways. Various financial services firms and banks are also adopting positive ESG strategies. Some banks, for example, are trying to go carbon neutral. They're trying to go paperless. They're trying to reduce their bank branches so that they're spending less on fuel and heat and so on. Where that's not just about cost cutting and fits in more broadly with their corporate agenda, that's real, that's authentic, that works. Quite frankly, if I think of a good ESG or CSR strategy that's authentic, it's this conference, this Congress. This is a bank sponsoring a conference on financial literacy to promote financial literacy among younger people. Those younger people are going to go out and open bank accounts. They're going to buy financial products. This is a win-win. This is a win for customers, for ordinary citizens. This is a win for financial services companies as well, who benefit from that boosted financial literacy. So again, I think this conference is such a great idea. It's an authentic example of CSR ESG.
Thank you so much. We have already talked about central banks, we have talked about consumers, but there is another agent that is very relevant in our economy, that are small and medium enterprises. So are small and medium enterprises seeing the benefits of committing to sustainability? Is it really an opportunity also for these smaller companies, small and medium enterprises? What's your opinion about that? Because I know that you have worked about this topic, Professor de Vivero. What do you think should be the position of small and medium enterprises in this process?
Okay, large companies are already under sustainability legislation that will eventually reach small and medium-sized companies. I believe it seems that small and medium-sized companies will have an opportunity to get a competitive advantage over other similar companies if they get ahead. So this will certainly allow them to stand out from others, for example, in the face of a consumer that we are talking a lot in this round table, who increasingly value sustainability. So commitment to sustainability has impact on the company's reputation, reduces costs, and also helps it to innovate and reach new markets. That is the key. So this has a lot to do with the value chain. Since large companies will have a competitive advantage if they manage to drive their value chain and get upstream suppliers and downstream customers to align themselves with this desire to be increasingly sustainable. So small and medium-sized companies play a crucial role in the world economy, as you know. And other important issue here is the supply chain. As more and more large companies are choosing their suppliers with social and environmental criteria in mind. So added to this is the opportunity to sign different types of contracts, for example, with the public sector. Nowadays, tenders increasingly including compliance with its sustainability standard in that type of contract. And in the area of finance, for this type of companies, they
access to sustainable finance, for example, through funds with sustainable criteria, through social, green and sustainable bonds, as well as through financial credits in, for example, lines of credits, microcredits, or renting, leasing, or something like that. So the answer obviously is yes, yes.
Thank you so much. I think we are running out of time. We have just 5 minutes left. So I would like to give you, each one of you, a final 1-2 minutes in order to ask your opinion if there is something missing in this discussion or some ideas that you would like to highlight in this last 5 minutes, okay? So first of all, I shall begin with you, Jose Maria. If you want to consider something that is relevant to be taken into account in the SME.
Well, I think all the main issues have been exposed. I take the last intervention of Joe. Thank you, first of all. And yes, this is a seed that will grow, as I said before. But what I wonder is how could we make this sustainability or ESG transition faster? Mm-hmm. It is not something we can do in a couple of years when we've been destroying the environment for 200. It is a very long and complex process, but finally, our last message, especially for young people, it is not just on the side of the industry. It is on the side of people, financial users, consumers, and as long as people include in their decision-making all these criteria, this transition will evolve faster.
I strongly agree with you, considering that financial education is crucial in this process. Professor De Vivero, would you like to share any more thoughts about the...
One idea I would like to highlight about the duty of care of directors that is so important, strongly important, because we will have a new regulation about that in Europe, that the proposal of a directive about the due diligence and sustainability. So we will see the new standards, the new obligation for the directors. So that is the problem now in our company law regulation. So that is the last idea that I give you on floor.
And finally, I would like to give the last minutes. You can have a couple of minutes or maybe more, because you are our international guest today. We are all very grateful to having you here, Joe. Tell us some topics, some ideas that you think are critical on this topic, or something that you need, that you consider that for our students it is relevant to keep in mind as a conclusion of this table.
Thank you. I've benefited a lot from the conversations here today. I'll be very brief. Really, my message would be to you that, you know, your expectations of where you work and how the businesses you work for do their business is also a very significant factor in shaping future ESG. You're probably going to try to work for businesses and companies that align with your own particular values. And that's going to make those businesses adopt and deepen their own ESG strategies, because they're going to want to attract talent, they want to retain talent. So don't underestimate your own power in trying to shape the ESG agenda and to shape the workplace practices of the future places you're going to work. One very final thing I would mention, just in terms of where I think ESG is going to go, is that increasingly we're seeing a role being played by data analytics in society, particularly as our own reliance on technology increases. That's going to be harnessed by ESG in various ways. It's going to make us better able to figure out, if the strategies adopted by banks and other companies are actually real. It's going to allow us to measure ESG. It's going to allow us to use natural language processing software and so on, other techniques, to be able to verify if the reports that are being written on ESG by banks are real. It's also going to mean that because we are increasingly using technology, there is going to be more concerns around how companies and banks and other financial services providers use your data. So there are data privacy concerns. There are concerns around ethical artificial intelligence. There are concerns even around digital literacy. Increasingly, I think we're going to start to consider that as part of the ESG agenda too. It's not just about climate change, although that's incredibly important too. It's not just about the social aspects, but it's also about technological aspects that go to who we are, how we use our data, and how other people use it too. Thank you.
So, thank you so much. We finished this round table, and I think they deserve an applause from all of us.